Sincere thanks to the Planet Fuel Charitable Foundation for sponsoring our Young, Gifted, and Wild About Birds series, and to Tom Anderson and the Connecticut Audubon team for putting together such a stimulating and informative series. Tonight's presentation is for people who want to see nature thrive in their yards, towns, and cities. Now let me introduce Dr. Desiree Narango, our presenter. Dr. Narango is a David H. Smith Conservation Research Fellow, postdoctoral researcher at UMass Amherst. Just last month, she was named an Early Career Fellow of the Ecological Society of America, which said she was elected for pioneering research on the connections between native plants, insects, and birds in the human-dominated urban and agricultural ecosystems. For excellence in communicating ecological concepts and the importance of native plants to the urban public, and for promoting diversity and inclusion in ecology. Desiree is busy this spring doing field research on birds migrating through parks in Springfield, Massachusetts. We thank her for taking the time to share her research with us in this final presentation of the first Young, Gifted, and Wild About Birds season. Welcome, Dr. Desiree Narango.
Thank you so much, Pam, for that introduction. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen now. Thank you so much, everyone, for being here, too. I am just beyond honored to be invited to be a part of this wonderful seminar series. There's been a lot of really great speakers, including Deja Perkins, Maria Mar Gutierrez, Dennis Liao, Eliza Grams, and Jordan Rutter and Gabriel Foley from the Bird Names for Birds movement. If you haven't seen any of those talks yet, I highly encourage you to go check them out. Yes, I am most certainly wild about birds, but I am also wild about a lot of critters and wildlife. And so I hope that you're excited this evening and ready for kind of a whirlwind overview of some of my work studying the plant and animal neighbors in our yard. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. Like Pam was saying, most of my research kind of takes place on human-dominated land. And if you think about it, that's pretty much everywhere. We have dramatically and rapidly transformed the world to support a growing human population. And with that comes really cascading effects on habitat quality for wildlife. But we're also facing dramatic losses of biodiversity around the globe and extinction of nature experiences in every generation. And so our grand challenge as conservationists, as members of the global public, is to really ask the question, how can we share our world with biodiversity while simultaneously supporting people and also inspiring them to care as well? I would argue really that we can't have successful conservation in this era unless we incorporate privately managed land. Currently in the United States, more than 60% of it is considered privately owned. And there's some estimates for the lower 48 that 10 to 15% of that is residential areas alone. And this is, a lot of the land in our urban and suburban areas where habitat is already extremely limited from development. And so if we really want to improve these areas for biodiversity, we need to study them, number one. But then we also, as scientists, we need to provide the information that you can then use in your everyday decision-making. So that's where I come in. But, I also want to mention that right now is really ripe for big conservation action and novel action that everybody is involved with. The UN has stated that the 2020s are the decade of ecosystem restoration. And in addition, our current administration has proposed that 30% of our country will be protected and conserved by 2030. These are really lofty, ambitious goals, and it's my opinion that our urban and suburban areas and green spaces are a really important part of that solution and for success with these policies. But increasingly, we are seeing stories of conservation success that includes urban areas and especially residential yards, from butterflies like the Atala butterfly that were presumed to be extinct suddenly showing up in gardens when people started to plant their host plants. We have endangered orchids that are thriving in Miami. The rusty-papped bumblebee has populations that are hanging on in Minnesota. And even in our work in Boston, Massachusetts, we were finding wood thrush in people's yards. And with this increasing interest in wildlife-friendly landscaping practices, I'm really optimistic that we're going to continue seeing this sort of success. But we also know that not all of our yards are able to support these species. And so we need a better understanding of the specific features and mechanisms that lead to this high quality habitat for wildlife. And so that's really where my research comes in, is to try to find what these features are and find those quantitative estimates that we can offer to help you make those decisions. And so one of the first things that I'm going to talk to you this evening is about some of my research studying residential yards across the United States. And so in urban areas in particular, residential yards are actually most of the green space and the plant biomass. In some cities in the UK, the yards were making up more than 50% of the plant biomass that was available in the city. And so this is a real conservation challenge because management of those individual parcels are made by the owners that are each making decisions based on their own needs and values. And so, for example, this photo that I show here is kind of what we would call the tidy lawn aesthetic, which is a very popular landscaping style in suburban United States. It's composed of a turf lawn, a few trees and shrubs here and there. But, you know, as you might imagine, this might not support that much biodiversity. And so it hasn't really been studied. But increasingly, we're seeing more interest in different alternative landscaping styles, like a nature-based approach. And this could be planting pollinator gardens or creating other kind of wildlife habitat like plants or soil or feeders or nest boxes. And while nature-based landscaping is considered to be a sort of conservation solution to share our homes with nature, there's been actually really surprisingly little information to test whether these landscaping styles are actually restoring land in the way that we think that they are. And so with some colleagues of mine, I worked on a project called the American Residential Macro Systems Project, which is this really amazing interdisciplinary collaboration between ecosystem scientists and wildlife ecologists and even social scientists all across the United States. And we were collecting a ton of different information about the wildlife, about the plants, but also the soil, the water, the nitrogen, and the people and their values too. And all of us were doing all the same data collection in 6 different cities across the United States, including nearby Boston, Massachusetts. And with my colleagues, all of our work was with the goal in mind to think about how can we actually manage our cities and suburbs in ways that we can provide ecosystem services, we can support biodiversity, and we can also be more resilient to global change. And a real major goal of this project is to look at these questions, but also see, are these patterns generalizable across the United States? So are the things that we see in Boston the same that we're seeing in Phoenix, Arizona? And so for a lot of this work, we're comparing different yard types or land management types. And so 2 of the types that we were looking at are what we were calling lawn-dominated yards. So we have lawn-dominated yards. We have lawns that have lots of input of resources into them, such as fertilizers and pesticides, and just lots of management taking place on these lawns. And then we have what we would call low input lawns, which are still lawn dominated, but maybe the householder thinks, meh, I'm just gonna let it go. I don't need fertilizer. I don't need all that stuff, but I still like my lawn. And then we also had two different kinds of conservation yards. So we had wildlife friendly yards that were certified by the National Wildlife Federation. And we also had water conservation yards, which in the eastern United States were rain gardens primarily. And in the western United States, so Phoenix, Arizona, and LA, they were landscaping your yard with drought tolerant landscaping practices. And so we were comparing all these different yard types, and then we were also comparing them to different parks that were found both within the city, so urban parks that are in the urban core surrounded by development, and also what we called reference parks, which for these purposes is really, think of a natural area that's outside of the city. And so we compared all these different land management types in terms of their plant and animal diversity. And so we collected a ton of different data in these tiny yard parcels. So first we had trained botanists go out and measure and identify almost every single plant that was in these yards, just monumental efforts. Thank you, botanists. And then we also had trained ornithologists go out and they did point count surveys where they recorded all the birds that they saw and heard in multiple visits to these yards. And then we also had our technicians go out and collect data on some of the insect community as well. So we used very high-tech methods of putting out little tiny plastic bowls and then waiting for the insects to fall in them so we could collect them and then take them to the lab to identify. And we were primarily focusing on the ground arthropod community as well as the bee community as a representative of a group of pollinators. And so here are some of the results from this project. And some of this is still in progress, but I'm going to talk to you a little bit about some of the patterns that we see. And so when we look at the plant communities that are in these yards, we find that when we compare the different yard types, our conservation yards are not that different actually from the lawn dominated yards in terms of plant abundance as well as tree canopy. So we see most of the variation happening between cities. We have lots of tree canopy in Boston. We have very little tree canopy in Phoenix, Arizona. That's not surprising, but not a lot of difference between those different yard types. But where we do see a lot of difference is in the number of plant species that are found in these yards. And so for our conservation yards, we see much, much more plant diversity compared to both of our lawn types, as well as the parks as well, which is probably maybe not surprising to you if you think about how we garden and we landscape. We want to see lots of different things. We want to see beautiful flowers and trees and shrubs and just tremendous diversity. It's a really novel plant community in these residential yards. And so what does that mean when we look at the insect community that we were also studying in these yards? First, let's talk about what we saw in the bees. So we collected a ton of bees, thousands and thousands of different bees that had to be identified. I'm not going to share with you all the information, but I will tell you that in Boston, Massachusetts, in the 16 or so yards that we studied, we documented 40 different species of bees, which is about 10% of the bee community that's available in Massachusetts, which may not seem like very much, but we didn't visit these yards very much. We only visited them like once or twice, and we got 40 different species of bees, from mining bees, the adrenids, small carpenter bees, and furrow bees, just tremendous diversity. And we tended to find that conservation yards in particular were always great for bees. No matter if you were in Boston, Massachusetts or Phoenix, Arizona, they were always wonderful. And they tended to have more of our bees with the most specialized life history traits. The reason that we think that these yards have more of these specialized bees is because they tend to have more resources available for them. So they tend to have more native plant diversity, especially in the flowering plants. They tend to have more nesting locations. So they tend to have dead stems as well as bare ground. And they also tend to have more heterogeneity, which means just a lot of different types of resources and habitat within the yard. And so when you have that heterogeneity of resources, that equals more bees with more specialized life history traits. And so this brings me to my first action item for you, which is how can you bring bees to your yard? And so this is some work from a colleague of mine here at UMass Amherst. And what she found is that one way that you can bring bees to your yard is by just being lazy. Just stop mowing as much. And she actually found that if you reduce your mowing from mowing every 1 week to mowing every 2 weeks, that increases the plant diversity. It also increases native plant diversity. There's a lot of lawn cover plants that will come up when you stop mowing so much. And that also increases the number of pollinators that are going to visit your yard. You're going to increase plant diversity, increase heterogeneity, and that's going to benefit the pollinator community. So that's one thing that you can do for your yard. The second group that I'm going to talk about here is the ground arthropods. And so we just collected, again, tons of different diversity of arthropods. And these are insects and other arthropods that are traveling along on the ground. And so just in Boston, Massachusetts alone, and just in the yards, we collected more than 200 different species of ground arthropods. It took a long time to identify these. And these are just a few of the examples of things that we saw. So we found carabid ground beetles, camel crickets and ground crickets, springtails, which are an amazing indicator of soil quality, wolf spiders, and just, I think we collected over 90 different species of ants across the United States. I didn't even know there were 90 species of ants. It was crazy. And if you're looking at this slide right now and you're thinking, I don't care about any of these insects, I assure you, you should care about these, because having these healthy ground arthropod communities is a very great indicator of a healthy ecosystem. And we want to have healthy populations of insects that are beneficial to us. So it was just wonderful to see this incredible diversity that's in people's yards. And so some of the results that I'll share with you, because we haven't gotten through all these insects yet, but we have looked at the ground beetles. And if you're not familiar with ground beetles, they are a type of predatory beetle. They're a beneficial predator that will eat, pests that are found on your plants and on your in your yard. So you want to keep these critters around. And they're also really beautiful, lots of metallic colors and really just amazing looks to them. And what we found with the ground beetles is that our conservation yards tended to have high diversity. They tended to have high abundance compared to both the parks and our lawn-dominated yards. And they tended to have slightly more species that have those specialized life history traits. But the other thing that we found is that the benefit of having a conservation yard was actually dependent on the tree canopy, both that the person had in the central yard, as well as what their neighbors had as well. And so in order to have a great ground arthropod community, you kind of have to have a little bit of buy-in from your neighbors as well. We have to scale up our yards from just one parcel to some larger size parcel of restored habitat. And so here in this graph, we have percent tree canopy here on the x-axis from 0 to 90%. And we have a predicted ground beetle richness here on the Y. And these purple colors are our conservation yards. So you see that there's not much different when tree canopy is low, because these beetles are really responding to tree canopy. But as you increase the tree canopy, the benefit of having a conservation yard basically skyrockets. There's an interaction effect that's happening here. And so our conclusions from some of our analyses on these ground beetles so far is that really, if you want to promote this community of insects, we need to have more tree canopy, we need to have more leaf litter, and we also, again, need to have more heterogeneity of resources that are in the yard, which these conservation yards tend to have. And so that brings me to my next action item for you, which is number 2. Leave the leaves in your yard. So a lot of folks in the fall, they like to rake up everything and make it look really nice. But I would encourage you this fall to think about maybe leaving some of that behind, because those leaves are going to make your soil healthier. It's going to add nitrogen. It's going to keep appropriate microclimates for your plants. But it also provides important wintering habitat for our insects, like our beetles that I just talked about, but also other insects like moths that spend the winter in a cocoon in the leaf litter. Our bumblebee queens also hibernate in our leaf litter in the wintertime. And of course, gotta love our birds. Our leaf litter is actually a bird buffet. And so if you want to provide habitat for birds to forage in, keeping some leaf litter in your yard is a wonderful way for you to do that. In fact, for some bird species like chickadees and kinglets, in the wintertime, their diet is actually 50 to 90% insects. So our kinglets are eating 90% insects in the wintertime. Where are they finding these insects? They're finding overwintering ones that are wintering in our leaf litter as well as in our trees. So I would encourage you to keep as much of that leaf litter as you feel comfortable with, and that will help our pollinator and our arthropod communities. So now I want to talk a little bit about the bird data that we found in these yards. So like I said before, we had trained ornithologists go out and they looked at the bird community and recorded every species that they saw. And what we found was that the conservation yards were better, but a little bit better. So what we found is that we found tons of different species, 35 different species of birds that are in these yards. I'm sure a lot of the birders here could find many more over the course of the year, but this was just a couple of weeks in the breeding season. We had lots of common species like tufted titmouse, also forest-dependent species like pine warbler, and just beautiful charismatic species like Baltimore oriole. And what we found is that these conservation yards tended to have high diversity, actually higher than our parks. They also tended to support species that had high public appeal. So we actually used some quantitative data from Google searches to rank species in terms of how popular they were. And not surprisingly, the birds that are in your yard are much more popular than the birds that were found in the parks. But the really important finding that we found was that there was a lot of heterogeneity between our wildlife-friendly yards. And so what that means is that the bird community in one wildlife yard tended to be very different from the bird community in another wildlife yard. And whereas in a lawn-dominated yard, we were seeing the same birds again and again and again: house sparrows, starlings, mourning doves, pigeons. But we were getting a lot of different kinds of species in the wildlife-friendly yards. What we didn't get in these yards were species of conservation concern. And so we actually looked at some data from Partners in Flight and some population trends to see if these species were declining. Are they important to our local federal agencies? And we weren't really seeing those species that were showing up in people's yards. And so that begs the question of, why might that be? Why are we not seeing these species in these yards? And so that brings me to my third action item, which is plant native plants. That's a wonderful thing that you can do to benefit the bird community that's in your yard. And this is some work that I've been doing for a long time, looking at native plants and their interactions with both insects and birds. And so I'm going to spend a little bit of the rest of the talk kind of talking about those findings as well. And so what we found really so far is that when you select native plants, so these are plants that are native to your local ecosystem, they tend to support food webs and restore the biodiversity and the ecosystem health of your yard. And so why is that? Why are native plants important? And the reason is that over 90% of our insects are actually very specialized for these native plants. Some of you here may be familiar with monarch butterflies that feed on milkweed. But what many folks don't realize is that more than 90% are specialized to some degree. And so that's because our butterflies and our moths have adapted over evolutionary time to feed on very particular host plants for which they've overcome those nasty, chemical compounds that are found in leaves. And they also adapt to like the morphology and the timing of that plant as well. And so one really great example of this is in this double-tooth prominent, which is a caterpillar that feeds specifically on elm trees exclusively. And you can see that this caterpillar actually fits in really nicely with the double-tooth elm leaf as well. And so what we find is, when we look at entire communities of butterflies and moths, so this is data for Massachusetts. Sorry, I should have grabbed Connecticut, but we're close enough, right? So in Massachusetts, we have over 2,249 different species of butterflies and moths. That's a tremendous, amazing diversity. And so what we tend to find is that some of our plants, like our oaks, our cherries, our willows, are supporting hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of species of these caterpillars and moths. And then on the other end of the spectrum, we have a whole slew of non-native plants for which these butterflies and moths are not able to use them yet. So we have things like lilac trees that support only 26 caterpillars species. And actually for a non-native plant, for a plant that hasn't evolved with our ecosystem, 26 is actually quite a bit. It's actually impressive for a non-native plant, but you can see it's really just a fraction of the diversity that's found on our native trees and shrubs. And we have things like ginkgo supporting 6, bamboo, 1. There's 1 caterpillar that uses bamboo. And then a whole slew of popular plants that you can find at your local nursery or Home Depot or Lowe's, like Japanese elms, hosta, cosmos, marigolds. They're not known to support any Massachusetts caterpillars at all. And so you can see that from a biodiversity perspective, they're not adding a lot of bang for the buck for planting those plants. And so that, that's some of the comparison with native and non-natives. And we've looked across the whole plant community. We see that on average, native plants support 4 to 5 times more caterpillar species compared to those non-natives. But a lot of my more recent research has actually stepped out of this native, non-native dichotomy and looked at the variation that we find in our native plants as well. And so what we've actually found is that when you look across the entire United States, when you look at how many caterpillars are on how many plants, and this is plant species, or this is derived from the host plant literature. So we actually go back and read papers from like 1920 and 1910 that says this caterpillar was found on this plant. And we just amassed this huge database of plant caterpillar interactions. And we find that only 14% of the plant genera in the United States are supporting more than 90% of the caterpillar species. And so here on the right, you'll see this box plot here. And for, there are only 20 plant genera that are supporting more than 5% of the caterpillar species that are out there. And the average number of caterpillar species that a plant genera supports is less than 0.5%. So you can see that there's really these power players, and oaks are really on top here, supporting more than 20% on average of the caterpillar community. These oaks are really doing the lion's share of supporting the diversity of this plant-eating insect food web. And if you don't want to look at this, box plot, here's the other part of this lovely comic that a friend of mine made for me. And this is the top 5 plants across the United States. It doesn't matter if you're in Boston, Massachusetts, or Hartford, Connecticut, or in Austin, Texas. Oaks, willows, cherries, pines, and poplars are always good choices. They're getting a lot of bang for the buck if you plant those plants. But you might be thinking, well, this is the Audubon Society. I don't care about caterpillars and butterflies and moths, but I assure you that you totally should. And the reason for that is that our birds eat insects, and our insects, especially our caterpillars, are incredibly important for supporting our native bird populations. In fact, in the United States, more than 440 of our bird species rely on insects, at least in some point of the annual cycle. More than 70% of our birds worldwide eat mostly insects. So more than 50% insects are in their diet. And caterpillars in particular are disproportionately important because they have high protein, which is important for growing bones and feathers. They have high calories, which makes them really efficient power packages of food. And they also have really high carotenoids, which makes them great for immune function as well. And so some of my work that I've done in other residential yards, this time in Washington, D.C., is to go back and look at this native and non-native plant comparison, but also how different tree species are supporting birds. And we were looking at this from the perspective of the Carolina chickadee, which is the southern cousin of your black-capped chickadee up here. And we use this little chickadee basically to ask the question of whether our urban birds are preferring native trees and which ones are they preferring. And in these different yards in DC, this is just kind of an overview of some of our study system. And we put up these PVC nest boxes that are very attractive to chickadees. And we put them up so that we could get them to nest in these yards. And then we could do some really nice habitat surveys of the plants and the insect community to see how the plant community was then affecting food resources for this little chickadee. But of course, we also had to monitor these birds anywhere that they were nesting, which was not always our nest boxes. And we actually found birds nesting in mailboxes. This bird nested in this mailbox 3 years in a row, and it was always successful. So it really goes to show that if the habitat is good, the birds will find a way. And so, one of the questions that we asked was really whether these native plants are providing more food for these birds. And we found that, yes, native plants were overwhelmingly supporting more caterpillar biomass for these birds to eat. They were supporting more species, and more species means more food for birds. So we want to plant those native plants. But one of the more alarming things that we found is that when we have yards that have increasing dominance of non-native plants, so these again are plants that were not native to this region that we were studying, so they weren't native to the eastern United States. We found that as these non-native plants increased in dominance, the number of young that these chickadees were fledging strongly declined. And the reason for this is that these chickadees just avoided yards that had lots of non-native plants. And if they did breed in these yards, they were fledging fewer young, and also young that were fledging in poorer conditions. So these birds just weren't able to find as much food as they needed when these non-native plants were really dominant. And so, that was a really concerning, concerning result that we found. And when we see this, it can be depressing to see, consequences to these birds, but I'm a conservation optimist. So I want to know, what should I do? What plants should I plant? And so to answer that question, I really let the chickadees tell me what plants did they want to have. And we did that by using a method called color banding, where we actually put plastic band. We caught the birds using very safe methods. And we put these plastic bands on their legs so that we could identify individuals. And then we followed them around the neighborhood to see what trees are they foraging in while they're feeding their young. And so we get to make these really beautiful maps like this. So this is a bird that was breeding in Northwest DC. The star here is where this bird had its nest. The dark blue is where it spent most of its time, into the light blue. And this is its whole foraging territory. It used a sweet gum nearby, a black cherry in the neighbor's yard, willow oaks that were planted along the street. But there was a whole slew of green space that's in this neighborhood that this chickadee was basically avoiding. And so, what is this bird avoiding? What were they not foraging in? And the answer to that, which may not surprise you, given that they support little biomass of caterpillars and other insects, is that these birds were avoiding non-native plants. In fact, almost all of the territories that we studied overwhelmingly preferred native plants over non-native plants. These non-natives were basically like statues in the landscape, not doing anything for my poor chickadees. And so we see this really beautiful linear relationship in native plants, where the more caterpillar species that a plant supports, the more that these birds are preferring it. And the reason for this, again, is because when you have more species of caterpillar, you have more biomass that's available to eat. And so in our non-native plants, we see that they were generally avoided by these birds. They were much less preferred. And the relationship between preference and number of caterpillar species was also a lot weaker as well. And so really these non-native plants are just not reliable for food for these chickadees, especially during the breeding season. And so again, you know, I just want to reiterate, like it's one thing, and it's a very interesting result to find that native plants are preferred. But actually what I think is more interesting is that this number of caterpillar species that a tree supports can actually be a really great proxy for how preferred that tree is for these insect-eating chickadees. And so this is data for the Washington, D.C. system. We see that the top plants that these birds were foraging in relative to their availability were oaks, which in the DC area support over 500 different species of caterpillars. Maples are supporting almost 300, cherries over 400. And so these birds are really keying into these, again, these power player trees that are doing the lion's share of supporting most of the caterpillar diversity, which means they're also supporting the lion's share of food available for this bird to feed their young nestlings in the nest. And so when I got these results, I was like, this is great. I love this. This is actually a quantitative measure that we can offer to people. And that information is available for you. You can get that for your region, for your zip code, and for the trees that you're interested in. You can go to the National Wildlife Federation's Native Plant Finder database. It's in beta mode. We're currently working on it, but it's still a good resource to check out and to touch base with in the future. You can put in your zip code and you can find native plants for your area. And you can also see how many caterpillar species that they support as well. Because we all know that we have different reasons for planting plants, such as I need one for the shade. I need one for dry soil. I want one with pink flowers. But if you're including wildlife and bird diversity as part of that equation, now you have a way to make relative comparisons among tree species that satisfy those other characteristics. And you can use the number of caterpillar species as a means to do your plant selection. Another website that you can check out is the Audubon Society's Native Plant database. They also have a wonderful resource that's available for you to look up plant lists for your zip code that are native to your ecosystem. The last thing that I want to touch on here is another amazing thing that we discovered while we were studying these chickadees. So the chickadees told us a very interesting story, but it's only one part of the story. And while we were studying these chickadees when they're breeding, it was also spring migration. And so the same trees where we were watching our chickadee pairs forage were just dripping and covered in amazing warblers and vireos and orioles and tanagers and gnatcatchers. All kinds of migrants were using these same trees because they were traveling through on their journeys north. And in fact, by the end of our study in Washington, D.C., we had documented more than 50 different species of migratory birds that were using residential yards for stopover, and over 20 different species of warbler. I say that because I'm a big warbler fan. And we also documented numerous declining species of conservation concern that were using these urban yards during their migratory journeys. And we know now also that a lot of these urban areas are actually attracting birds because of artificial light, to use these urban areas in higher densities than we actually see in the surrounding landscape. And so when we got these results, you know, a lot of the questions that people had for me was, that's wonderful. I've never seen a chestnut-sided warbler before. How are they doing? And the answer to that question was, I don't know, because nobody really studies migratory birds in urban and suburban areas. And so I don't like to have questions unanswered. And I was fortunate that I was able to get funding from the Society of Conservation Biology to actually start answering this question. And so this is my new project that's nearby here in Springfield, Massachusetts. I call it the Springfield Birds Project. And we're studying urban parks in Springfield to see which ones are supporting the most migratory birds in diversity and abundance and density, as well as how well are these migrants doing when they stop over in the city? Are they able to find enough food so that they can get the fat in order to make the rest of their 1,000-kilometer flights to the boreal north? And the real important questions that I have is really, what are they eating? We have no idea what these birds are eating when they're going north. Are they prioritizing caterpillars? Are they looking for other things? And I'm also very interested in seeing if these oak trees, which are these power players, are doing the lion's share of supporting our migratory bird communities as well. And so I'm just gonna go through this a little quickly. So one of the questions that we're asking that I think is really fun is we're actually using poop to understand how to manage our forest communities. So we're collecting poop samples from warblers and vireos that we're finding in these forests. And then we're using DNA sequencing to find out what plants and insects that they're relying on. And that allows us to make these really, wonderful networks of interactions that provide us with wonderful information about how should we manage our forests? What sort of trees should we prioritize? It can also give us information for particular species like blackpoll warbler, which is a threatened species of Massachusetts. If we want to support blackpoll warblers in their journeys north, what trees are they relying on? Are they relying on a fewer species than some of the other migratory birds that we're finding? And then we can also look at the entire community of birds and see what happens to that interaction network of the food web if we take a plant out. If we lose our oak community, what does that mean for what trees that these birds might be relying on? And so it provides us with a lot of interesting information to help us make predictions for how the forest community would affect the birds, but also to help inform our selection when we manage these forests as well. This project is just starting, so I don't have any results for you yet, but I encourage you to stay tuned. You can follow us on Twitter, hashtag Springfield Birds. We're just starting to catch birds in the forest. We're just starting to see caterpillars. And so I'm really excited to find out what these birds are going to tell me about how we should manage our urban green space. But in the meantime, our chickadees told us a lot of good information too. And so if you're making decisions going forward, I encourage you to cultivate these habitat highways that help these birds make their journeys north and south. From the Arctic to the Amazon, if you plant bird-friendly native plants, you'll be providing food for these birds to make that journey. So in conclusion, I share with you a lot of different results from some of my work, but just to recap some of that, I shared with you some evidence that yards vary in resources and their habitats for wildlife, but on average, our conservation-oriented yards are doing pretty great at supporting diversity. We need to really retain native plant diversity as well as heterogeneity of resources such as leaf litter and ground cover, and that can help you to create wildlife habitat at home. And finally, with our landscaping, we can use some of the data that these birds are telling us to help us make informed decision-making to support our most sensitive insectivorous birds. And again, I encourage you to tune in to find out what we find out about these migrants. But I think the most important result that I'm sharing with you today, and the one I really want you to take home, is that our gardens matter, our yards matter. And those simple choices that you make in your day-to-day, such as what tree to plant or how many times that you mow, can have really far-reaching implications for biodiversity. And if you prioritize ecological interactions in your landscaping, you can create not only beautiful, but functional habitat as well. And so my last action item for you is to explore your gardens, find out who your plant and animal neighbors are. And if you're interested, Connecticut Audubon is holding their BioBlitz, which is tomorrow, and you can still sign up. You can visit this website and you can get more information about joining this community science project. If you want more help on identifying some of the critters that are in your yard, you got to check out iNaturalist. It's one of my favorite websites where you can crowdsource identifications from experts, and you can find out, what's this moth? What's this plant? What's this bird that I'm seeing in my yard? You can get a lot of great resources and see what's found in your area. And finally, I gotta say, another community science project, I'm sure a lot of you eBird, but we don't get a lot of eBird checklists in urban areas and not as many in people's yards. And so I encourage you to think outside of your favorite birding patch. Start birding some of these areas and seeing what migrants are using them. And that'll really provide some incredible data that we can use in urban planning and in conservation in these landscapes. So with that, thank you so much for your time. Happy Earth Day. And if you have any questions, you can always email me. You can find me on Twitter, #PlantsForWildlife, as well as all of the papers that I talked about with you today are found on my website. You can download any of them there. So yeah, thank you for your time, and I'll take any questions that you have.
Thank you so much, Dr. Narango. And you never really need to apologize for caring about caterpillars with this group, because we're about birds and other wildlife. In fact, you know, this over the non-nesting season, we had a big project helping with northern metalmark butterflies. Just in the last couple of days, I was helping the state with tiger beetles, hairy-necked tiger beetles, and just today I was talking to a biologist about dwarf wedge mussels. So you know, we're about the entire ecosystem, not just the birds.
Woohoo! It's wonderful to hear. I love it.
Yeah, I mean, it's all interconnected, and you know, some of our other taxa are incredibly threatened, like weakfish and spotted turtles and wood turtles. So you know, we're all about the biodiversity of Connecticut.
Fantastic.
We have some great questions already in the chat. The first one comes from one of our state board members, Harshad Kunti. He wants to know if there's a good way to get rid of ticks while keeping the yard hospitable to other insects.
That's a good question, and that's one that I'm actually thinking about. So one thing that I can say is that my colleague, Susanna Lerman at the Forest Service, who did that study on the lawn mowing, so that was part of her data collection, was to see if you don't mow your lawn as much, do you get more ticks? Because we don't want to attract pollinators, but also, you know, expose us to Lyme disease. And she actually found very, very little, or I think she found 0 ticks in people's lawns. And so there wasn't more in the grass when you stop mowing. Ticks are very, you know, it's a very important thing for this region. I'm actually talking with a colleague about maybe exploring some of these questions in the future about tick exposure. You know, part of the reason that we have ticks that are going crazy is that, number one, invasive plants create microclimates that facilitate ticks to survive the winter better. And so getting rid of those invasive plants is one way that you can lower tick populations. But when we start to create these functional ecosystems, that will also help us to have those predators that keep the tick population down. So having a healthy ecosystem means that insects don't go out of control. They're kept at bay. So there won't be 0 ticks, but we'll at least, you know, having a functional ecosystem can help to keep those numbers down. But there's a lot more information. There's a lot more studies that we need to do for sure.
Great. Alicia, following, I can't do the full last name though. Asked, are there any trees that you would recommend for good tree canopy that do well in Connecticut? And I already predicted what your answer would be, but let's hear what you have to say.
I see the answer. Yeah. So first what I'll say is that it depends on where you're planting the tree, right? So like your arborist will have good recommendations for something that has to do with, that will do well in particular soils or in particular shade. I am not an arborist. I'm an ecologist. So I can only tell you what trees are going to support the most biodiversity. And for Connecticut, just like Massachusetts, you really can't go wrong with an oak. It supports tons of insects, tons of birds, tons of mammals, pollinators. It's just a wonderful, wonderful tree. Other ones that I really like are cherries, which are great for pollinators and birds. And then if you're not able to have a big tree, if you maybe are looking for something smaller in your landscape, our native viburnums tend to be overlooked, but they also have a lot of bang for the buck as well. And I just think they're just a wonderful addition to landscaping. Is any of our native viburnums, such as there's a cherry viburnum, there's maple leaf viburnum, there's arrowwood viburnum, there's possum haw viburnum. There's lots of choices, and they're all wonderful.
Yeah, and the native dogwoods are another of my favorites too. From the shrubs up to the flowering dogwood trees and the pagoda dogwoods, everything in between.
Yeah, dogwoods actually, they are really good for our specialist bees. So our bees that use very particular pollen sources, there's a whole slew, I think of 20 or so species in the Eastern United States that only use dogwood. And so even though, and dogwood also has a lot of fruit in the fall for birds. So yeah, I would totally agree. Dogwood's a great choice.
I had a quick question, and I had wondered if the double-toothed prominent has experienced massive population declines because of Dutch elm disease, or if it's adapted to other elms.
Yeah, so I don't know about population trends for that specific species off the top of my head, but it probably is not doing great when we lose elms. And that's one topic that the Forest Service is really interested in is what happens to the forest when we lose elms and also ashes, and also whether some of our cultivated elms and ashes are doing serving the same ecological function as the native genetic stock of elms and ashes. I can say just anecdotally that in DC, so some folks point out, they're like, elms were one of the species that chickadees were foraging in a lot. And I'm like, yeah, because most of them were street trees of the Princeton elm cultivar. And from a chickadee's perspective, it seemed to be doing okay. So I would, if I had to make a prediction, I would say that the double-tooth elms are doing fine if there are enough of the cultivars that are in the urban ecosystem.
It's interesting if you look at New Haven, the city of New Haven, at the turn of the 20th century. I believe that the most common breeding songbird in New Haven was least flycatcher. And that, New Haven was just loaded with elm trees. Today, least flycatcher is a very hard nesting bird to find. You find it in the northeast corner, a few really sets of good riparian habitats in the state. But to me, it just blows my mind that the least flycatcher was the common songbird in New Haven nesting at the turn of the 20th century. So it showed how important elms were.
Yeah, for sure. For least flycatcher in particular, they really key in on regenerating forest as well. And so at Hubbard Brook in New Hampshire, which is a long-term ecological station, they also see fewer least flycatchers than they used to historically. And part of that is because New England has reforested. Right. But of course, it's reforested in a completely novel tree community than what it was historically. So
on the decline side, that's one of the species that I've personally noticed a decline the most of in Connecticut. Blue-headed vireo also as the nesters really had a major decline. Georgia asks about, and we had a little discussion on this already, about some small stature trees that might be good power trees for insects.
Yeah, so I would encourage you to check out that website that I mentioned, the Native Plant Finder. And you can go to your nursery or maybe talk to a native plant landscaper, and they can give you some choices, and then you can use the number of caterpillar species as a way of ranking those different small statured trees. And like we said before, like viburnums are really awesome. You know, dogwoods, serviceberries, also crab apples. Like there are native crab apples. They're hard to find because our nurseries like to have those hybrids. But they can be wonderful additions that are really beautiful and also small and manageable too. And the other thing I can mention is that some of our more plant savvy horticulturalists are actually looking at different cultivars to make dwarf varieties of things like oak trees. So you can get dwarf swamp oak that doesn't get as big as a true oak, which is a much more manageable oak species. And it is a cultivar. So, you know, but with some work from my PhD advisor, Doug Tallamy, and I have done a project looking at different cultivars, and we actually found that when you change those traits, it doesn't do anything. It doesn't negatively affect the caterpillar community. So I would suspect that it's perfectly fine for birds as well.
That's great. I think we don't really have any time for more questions, but somebody did have a reference, Native Plants of the Northeast by Donald J. Leopold. I will put a plug in for Enhancing Your Backyard Habitats for Wildlife by Peter Pacone, put out by the Connecticut DEEP. You can get that for free online. I'll try to post a link before we close down this chat. So you have that direct link. But do you have a particular reference that you would recommend, Dr. Narango?
Oh, there's a lot of different references out there. And they can be overwhelming. So yeah, I would talk to your local native plant landscaper and have a conversation about that. Also, the Xerces Society has wonderful native plant lists specifically for pollinators. And the Audubon Society is also working on some more specific native plant lists for birds as well. So, you know, you can find, there's a lot of plants out there to choose from. It's just a matter of getting the information you need to make that decision making. And I'll also add, I see a lot of questions that are in here that I guess we don't have time to get to, but please feel free to email me, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you have if you just shoot me an email.
Yes, and I just wanted to again mention, and thank you earlier for mentioning our BioBlitz tomorrow. I really encourage you to apply. It's a lot of fun. It uses iNaturalist. You know, it's even if you have no clue as to what you're seeing, sometimes you get your answer. In fact, I just got someone corrected one of my IDs in iNaturalist from last summer. It happened to be a species of bush clover, and I had Virginiana, and it was Violaceae. Bush clovers are a great native species, great host plant, great nectar plant. So our Earth Day BioBlitz is tomorrow. And speaking of online databases, we use eBird for our, well, we encourage the use of eBird for a lot of reasons. We're a partner in the Connecticut Bird Atlas project, which utilizes eBird to collect its data. But we also use eBird as part of our Migration Madness weekend, which is coming up the weekend after Mother's Day. It's going to be that weekend every year. It's May 14th, 15th, and 16th, I think. I don't have my calendar open, but it is the Friday, Saturday, and Sunday after Mother's Day. It's a way to get out and celebrate migration in Connecticut at its peak, and to help raise money for our conservation efforts. We do great work. We're a 4-star charity on Charity Navigator. There's an incredible amount of exciting things going on at the Connecticut Audubon Society in terms of habitat restoration, education programming, education programs for all levels of people, from experts to beginners. Our policy work in Hartford and DC. It's really an exciting time to be a part of the Connecticut Audubon Society, and we hope you take part in Migration Madness. And I want to thank you all for doing your part to help us conserve birds and other wildlife here in Connecticut. Awesome. Yeah, it's the 14th through the 16th is Migration Madness.
So many wonderful things happening.
Great prizes involved in that too.
Sweet.
Well, thank you, everybody. Hope you have a good evening and enjoy migrations coming up soon. Well, it's actually happening right now, but the peak is coming up soon.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.